The map blinked and Earth vanished. Not dimmed, not flagged, not even quarantined. Deleted. 1 second. The blue-white star system hung in the center of the imperial lattice, tagged, indexed, threaded through 1,000 trade arteries. The next, it was gone. Not a signal blackout, not interference. A clean removal, as if the system had never existed. No alarm sounded. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The chamber didn't react like something catastrophic had just happened. No one stood. No one argued. 27 civilizations sat in perfect composure, their representatives illuminated by the soft glow of a system that had just erased 8 billion lives from its official reality and treated it like routine maintenance. I was still looking at the empty space where Earth had been when the verdict finished rendering. System designation Sol 3. The lattice announced in neutral tone. Status. Non-registered. All associated routes, contracts, and recognition protocols terminated. Non-registered. Not destroyed. Not condemned. Unrecognized. The difference hit a second too late. I leaned forward, pulling the interface closer, forcing the system to refresh. The coordinates were still there. Of course they were. You can't delete a star. But every layer that mattered, the lanes, the permissions, the identifiers that made a place real to interstellar infrastructure, had been stripped away. Earth hadn't been attacked. It had been removed from existence legally. Around me, the delegates began filing their confirmations. Quiet, efficient, no celebration, no hesitation. This wasn't punishment fueled by anger. This was procedure. I scanned the record feed, heart beating too fast for someone trained to stay detached. There was the clause that made my stomach tighten. Enforced under continuity, Doctrine 11. I froze. That doctrine hadn't been used in centuries. Not because it was illegal, because it was incomplete. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Far across the chamber, one of the observers, the kind that rarely spoke, rarely voted, rarely even attended, shifted slightly. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to interact with the record stream. A single input. No speech. No objection. No dissent. Just a mark. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't random. The system processed it instantly, burying the action under layers of administrative noise. No alert, no acknowledgement, nothing that would matter to anyone who wasn't actively looking for it. And suddenly, I couldn't shake the feeling that what had just happened in this room wasn't a final decision. It was a setup. My console pulsed. Incoming relay priority compression from the outer colonies. That shouldn't have been possible. Not anymore. I opened it. The message wasn't panicked. That was the second thing that felt wrong. We see the cut. It read, proceeding with phase line. Phase line? There was no such protocol in any official system. Another line followed before the signal destabilized. Do not respond through registered channels. They're blind outside their own map. The transmission died. I stared at the empty space where Earth had been, then at the silent chamber that believed it had just ended a civilization. Slowly, something shifted in my understanding. They hadn't killed us. They had just made a mistake they didn't even know existed. And whatever phase line was, humanity had been waiting for this. The silence after the deletion was procedural. That was the most unsettling part. No alarms. No emergency protocols. No escalation flags. Just a quiet reshuffling of a system adjusting to a change it fully believed was correct. I stayed seated longer than I should have. Not out of shock. I was past that already, but because standing would have meant accepting what had just happened, and something about the way the lattice processed Earth's disappearance felt incomplete. Around me, delegates began leaving in orderly streams, their movements efficient, almost indifferent. A few exchanged data packets. Others logged confirmations. No one looked toward the center display again, because there was nothing to look at. Earth wasn't marked red. It wasn't labeled restricted. It simply wasn't there. I forced my console to re-query the coordinates. Sol 3, non-registered. It replied instantly. No active data. No active data. I changed parameters. Broadened the scan. Switched to deep archive layers. For a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, the system hesitated. Then it returned something different. So, 3. Historical reference exists. Access restricted under continuity, Doctrine 11. There was again, continuity, Doctrine 11. I leaned back slowly, letting that settle. That doctrine wasn't designed for punishment. It was designed for containment of anomalies. Systems that couldn't be destroyed, couldn't be explained, or couldn't be safely integrated. And more importantly, it wasn't designed to be permanent, which meant one thing. This wasn't just exile. It was a classification error waiting to happen. My console flickered again. Not an official channel this time. A residual ping, bouncing through layers it shouldn't have had access to. The colonies, or what used to be recognized as colonies. I locked onto the signal before it collapsed completely. The compression was brutal, barely enough to reconstruct fragments. Line holds. Not collapse, compression phase successful. They're not watching the gaps. Then static. I sat very still. They weren't panicking. They weren't asking for help. They were executing something. And they expected me to understand what the gaps meant. I didn't. Not yet. I stood, finally, and moved out of the chamber. The corridor outside was already shifting back to normal operations. Ambient light recalibrated. Traffic resumed. A few non-aligned species moved through side passages, uninterested in the ruling that had just rewritten human existence. I started walking, fast, not toward my assigned quarters, not toward any official office, toward the archive sectors. If Doctrine 11 had been invoked, there would be precedent. Buried, restricted, forgotten, but still there. And if I was right, those precedents wouldn't show what the Empire intended. They would show what it had failed to control. The archive entrance recognized my credentials without question. That alone told me something. My status hadn't been revoked, which meant, technically, I still existed inside the system. I stepped inside. Rows of data pillars stretched into dim light, each containing layers of civilizations, conflicts, resolutions. Most of it was indexed, categorized, sanitized into clean historical narratives. Doctrine 11 records weren't. I had to dig. Old cases, fragmented systems, entities removed from official recognition. Some dissolved. Some collapsed exactly the way predictive models expected. But not all. One record caught my attention. Designation unknown. Species name redacted. Timeline incomplete. Outcome, status unresolved. Unresolved. That shouldn't exist. I pulled the file deeper. The details were partial, almost deliberately obscured. But one pattern stood out clearly. The system had been declared non-registered, cut off from all official lanes, erased from trade, communication, and navigation, exactly like Earth. The expectation had been simple: resource depletion, internal conflict, collapse. Instead, there were scattered reports, unverified sightings, unauthorized trade anomalies, signals that didn't match recognized frequencies. The file ended abruptly. No conclusion, no reintegration, no confirmation of extinction, just a note. Activity persists outside mapped infrastructure. I exhaled slowly. Outside mapped infrastructure. The gaps. The phrase from the colony message snapped into focus. The Empire didn't control space. It controlled the map of space. And everything outside that map didn't officially exist, which meant it wasn't monitored the same way, didn't follow the same rules, didn't trigger the same alarms. I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope, something sharper. Understanding. My console pinged again, hard this time. An internal alert. Not public. Restricted. I opened it. Unusual activity detected in adjacent sectors to former Sol designation. Of course, it was starting. Minor trade inconsistencies. Signal distortions. Resource movement outside predicted models. They were noticing, but not understanding. Not yet. I closed the alert and turned back to the archive. If one unresolved case existed, there could be more. And if humanity had studied them, if phase line was built on those patterns, then this wasn't survival. It was replication. I pulled another file, then another, each one incomplete, each one ending the same way. disappearance from the system, followed by faint, untrackable persistence beyond it. I stopped scrolling. A realization settled in, heavy and irreversible. The Empire thought it had erased humanity, but what it had actually done was remove the only structure that limited it. My console vibrated one more time. Direct channel this time, not from the colonies, from inside the station. Unknown source. I hesitated just for a second, then accepted. A single line appeared. No identification. No encryption signature I recognized. Just text. You're late. I went still. Another line followed. If you're reading archived doctrine cases, you've already figured out. Pause. Then, come to level 9. Bring nothing that belongs to their system. The channel cut. I stared at the message. Level 9. That wasn't part of the standard diplomatic sectors. And nothing that belongs to their system. That wasn't suggestion. That was a warning. I shut down my console. Not standby. Full disconnect. For the first time since Earth disappeared from the map, I did something that felt very, very human. I stepped outside the system on purpose and went looking for the part of the galaxy that wasn't supposed to exist. Level 9 wasn't on any official map. That alone told me I was in the right place. The access corridor ended 3 levels above where the directory insisted the station stopped. After that, the structure changed, lighting dimmer, surfaces less polished, systems quieter. It wasn't abandoned. It was unregistered. My boots sounded too loud as I moved deeper. No cameras tracked me. No system prompts followed my movement. For the first time since I had boarded the station years ago, I was inside something that was constantly observing, recording, categorizing. It felt wrong. It felt free. And it felt dangerous in a way I couldn't quantify yet. I slowed near a junction where the architecture shifted again. The walls here weren't uniform alloy anymore. They had been modified, layered, adjusted over time by different species with different needs. A place built without central oversight. The air changed too. Heavier, warmer, alive. You disconnected properly. The voice came from behind me. I turned. She didn't look like someone who belonged to the Empire. That was the first thing I noticed. Not because of biology, though her form was unfamiliar, but because of posture. There was no tension in the way she stood, no awareness of surveillance, no subtle alignment to invisible systems the way every official representative carried themselves. She wasn't performing for anything, which meant she wasn't being watched. Level 9 isn't accessible through standard registry, I said carefully. It isn't supposed to be, she replied. Her gaze held mine for a moment, measuring something I couldn't see. You took longer than expected. I wasn't told there was a clock. There always is, she said. I didn't respond to that. Instead, I stepped closer. You contacted me. No, she said. I confirmed you. That wasn't the same thing. A quiet realization settled in. She hadn't reached out randomly. She'd been waiting to see if I would notice the pattern. You marked the record during the vote. I said, yes. Why? She tilted her head slightly. Because they used Doctrine 11 incorrectly. I felt my focus sharpen. Incorrectly doesn't mean invalid. It does when the doctrine was never designed for systems that refuse to behave. That phrasing again. Refuse to behave. Like humanity. You've seen this before. I said. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved past me, gesturing for me to follow. The corridor opened into a wider chamber. Low light. No central console. No visible connection to the station's main systems. A table sat in the center. Physical, not projection-based, not integrated. Real. That alone was enough to confirm what I was starting to understand. Nothing in this space relied on the Empire's infrastructure. She stopped at the table and activated something embedded into its surface. A map appeared, not the Imperial lattice. Something else. It took me a second to process what I was looking at. Then it clicked. This wasn't a map of systems. It was a map of movement. Routes without official designation. Nodes that didn't exist in registered charts. Patterns formed by trade, migration, resource flow. None of it acknowledged by the Empire, but all of it undeniably real. The Empire believes control comes from ownership of map space, she said. They're not wrong, I replied. They're incomplete. She expanded the display. More lines appeared, more connections, some faint, some strong. And then I saw it. Human markers. Small at first, scattered, but present. How long? I asked quietly. Long enough, she said. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. I stepped closer to the table, scanning the network. This isn't coordinated, I said. These are independent builds, different designs, different methods. Yes. Then how are they aligning? She looked at me again. Because they are solving the same problem. That made my chest tighten. Humanity wasn't acting as a unified command. It was acting as a convergent system. Separate parts reaching the same conclusion. They knew this could happen, I said. Not exactly this, she corrected. But they knew dependence on a single structure is a weakness. I thought back to the colony message. They're not watching the gaps. They're building in the spaces the Empire doesn't track, I said. Yes. And the Empire doesn't track them because they don't believe anything valuable exists there. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Loaded. They're wrong, I said. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. I shifted my focus back to the map. These routes. I traced from the faint lines. They're unstable. Gravity distortions. Uncharted anomalies. Most ships wouldn't risk them. Most species optimize for safety, she said. And humans don't. Humans optimize for access. That landed harder than I expected. Access over safety. Movement over control. I exhaled slowly. That convoy, I said, the one that disappeared during the cut. Her eyes flickered just slightly. 2 ships were lost, she said. Not all of them, I replied. A pause. Then, no. Confirmation. One of them had made it. Not through the gate. Through the gaps. They seeded this, I said, looking back at the network. Yes. And the Empire doesn't even know it exists. Not yet. That word carried weight. Not yet. My thoughts move faster now. If they detect this pattern, if they recalibrate their monitoring, they will, she said calmly. And when they do, she met my gaze again. That depends on how quickly your species finishes what it started. A cold realization settled in. This wasn't a hidden survival network. It was incomplete, still forming, still vulnerable. How much time? I asked. Less than they think, she said. That's not helpful. It's not meant to be. Frustration flickered, but I pushed it down. Why help me? I asked. I'm not helping you, she said. Then what is this? She gestured to the map. This is observation. That's not true. No, she agreed quietly. It isn't. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not emotion. Recognition. We've seen this pattern before, she said. Systems that are cut off, compressed, forced inward, and they either collapse, her voice softened just slightly, or they become something the original system can no longer contain. I looked at the map again, at the growing web, at the human markers spreading through places the Empire didn't see. They're not trying to survive exile, I said. No, they're building something else. Yes. Silence again. Then I asked the question that had been forming since the chamber. What happens when they're done? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. Then the Empire will realize, a pause, that it didn't isolate humanity. Another pause. It felt deliberate, precise. It removed the only boundaries that were holding it in place. My pulse slowed, not from calm, from clarity. The Empire thought this was containment. But if this network finished forming, if humanity connected all these gaps, then containment wouldn't fail. It would become irrelevant. My console, offline disconnected, suddenly pulsed once. That shouldn't have been possible. I looked down. A manual override signal. External. Not from the Empire. From the network. I reactivated it just enough to read the message. 3 words. No encryption. No identification. First line complete. I looked up, slowly. They've already started. I said. She nodded. Yes. I felt something shift deep in my chest. Not fear, not hope, something sharper. They're faster than we thought. She studied me for a moment, then said, No. A pause. They're exactly as fast as they needed to be. And suddenly, for the first time since Earth disappeared from a map, I understood something terrifying. Humanity wasn't reacting to exile. It was executing a plan. And whatever came next, the Empire wasn't ready for it. The problem wasn't that the Empire would discover the network. The problem was when, and how much humanity could finish before that moment. I left Level 9 with nothing. No device. No record. No traceable interaction. Exactly as instructed. Bring nothing that belongs to their system. I understood that now. The moment something touched the Imperial lattice, it became visible, predictable, contained. And whatever humanity was building, it depended on staying outside that visibility for as long as possible. But I couldn't stay outside forever. Not if I wanted to help. The moment I reconnected my console, the system flooded back in. Notifications, alerts, internal flags. The Empire had started looking. Sector drift anomalies detected. Unauthorized signal echoes near non-registered zones. Trade discrepancies across peripheral systems. They weren't calling it a threat yet, but they had noticed something was wrong. I moved fast, pulling up the internal predictive reports. They hadn't changed. That was the dangerous part. The Empire still believed humanity was collapsing, still expected resource depletion, infighting fragmentation, still assumed time was on their side. They don't see it, I muttered. Of course they didn't, because they weren't looking for it. Their models were built to track civilizations that followed, predictable decline patterns. Humanity wasn't declining. It was compressing. I opened a restricted channel. Not official, not recorded. One of the colony nodes. It took 3 attempts before something responded. Static, then a voice. Calm, steady. This channel shouldn't exist, she said. It doesn't, I replied. A pause. Recognition. Good, she said. That means it's working. Status, I said. Operational. That's not enough. It is for now. I exhaled. Tell me what's happening out there. Another pause. Then we stopped thinking in terms of survival. My grip tightened on the console. Explain. We're not trying to outlast the exile, she said. We're trying to outgrow it. That matched the pattern. The map, the network. You're building infrastructure, I said. Yes. For what? A longer pause this time. Then, for movement. That word again. Movement. Access. Not territory. Not defense. Resources. I asked. Stabilizing. Losses. A beat. Acceptable. That hit harder than I expected. Acceptable losses meant there had been losses. I thought of the convoy. Of the ships that hadn't made it. Of the ones that had. They're starting to investigate, I said. Signal anomalies. Trade irregularities. They'll look in the wrong places, she said calmly. For how long? Long enough. That answer again. I clenched my jaw. That's not a strategy. It is when your opponent doesn't understand the game. Silence. Then I asked the question that mattered. How far along are you? Another pause. Different this time. Measured. We have local stability across primary nodes, she said. That's not what I asked. I know. I waited. Then, we're connecting them. My pulse slowed. Connecting meant phase transition. From isolated survival to system-wide operation. How many? I asked. Enough. That wasn't reassuring. It was confirmation. You need more time, I said. We're taking it. That's not how this works. No, she agreed. It's not. Another pause. Then, you should disconnect again. Why? They're getting closer. The line cut. I stared at the dead channel. Then, at the alert still flooding my system. She was right. The Empire was closing in. Not fast enough to understand, but fast enough to notice. And once they understood, it would be over. or it would escalate. I switched to internal monitoring. The investigations had increased. 7 active probes now, different departments, different methodologies, all looking at fragments of the same anomaly, none of them connecting it. Yet, I exhaled slowly. Time. Everything came down to time. How much humanity had, how fast the Empire adapted, and whether I could shift that balance. A sharp chime cut through my thoughts. Not an alert, a summons. Internal. Priority. I opened it. The inspector. Of course. They'd finally decided to stop watching from a distance. I arrived at the meeting chamber 5 minutes later. He was already there, waiting, for arms resting on the table. Still, controlled. You've been accessing restricted archives, he said without preamble. Not a question. A statement. Yes, I replied. Why? Continuity doctrine review. A pause. His upper limbs adjusted slightly. A subtle shift. You no longer have standing to conduct doctrinal analysis. I was not informed of that change. Another pause. Longer this time. You're still operating as if your system exists within ours. Careful. That was a test. I operate within the permissions currently assigned to me, I said. Neutral. Precise. He studied me. All 4 eyes fixed. Your system no longer exists, he said. There it was. The official position. I didn't respond immediately. Then, the coordinates still exist, I said. A flicker. Small, but real. Coordinates are not recognition, he replied. No, I agreed, but they are reality. Silence stretched between us. Then he leaned forward, just slightly. We are detecting irregularities, he said, across multiple sectors. I said nothing. We are determining whether those irregularities are connected. Still nothing. Another shift. You have been in proximity to several of those sectors. Not good. You have accessed historical cases involving non-registered systems. Worse. And you have initiated unauthorized communications. I kept my expression neutral. You are forming a pattern, he said. There it was. He didn't see the network, but he saw me, and that was enough. What are you looking for? He asked. I met his gaze. The same thing you are, I said. A pause. Then, and what is that? I let the silence stretch just a fraction too long, then said, what happens to something after you stop recognizing it? That was an answer. It was a mirror, and he knew it. The room went very still. Then, you are dismissed, he said. Too quickly, too clean. He didn't have enough. Yet, I stood, turned, walked out. Only when the door sealed behind me did I let the tension slip. That had been close. Too close. He was accelerating, which meant the timeline had just changed. I moved fast through the corridor, mind already recalculating. Humanity didn't have as much time as they thought. The Empire didn't need to understand the system to break it. They just needed to apply pressure in the right places. And pressure was coming. My console pulsed again. External, not through official channels. I opened it. 1 line, urgent. 2nd line, compromised. My chest tightened, so it had started. The network wasn't invisible anymore. Not completely. I looked up, mind racing. 1 node exposed meant others could follow. The Empire didn't need the whole map, just 1 thread, and the system would unravel. Unless it was designed not to. I took a slow breath, then turned back toward the deeper sections of the station, toward level 9, toward the only place that understood what was really happening. Because one thing had just become clear. This wasn't a hidden network anymore. It was a race. And humanity had just lost its first piece of ground. The message didn't feel like panic. That was the part that unsettled me most. 2nd line, compromised. No urgency markers. No distress code. No escalation priority. Just information, like a system reporting damage and continuing to function. I didn't go back to level 9 immediately. Not yet. If the network was built the way I was starting to suspect, then a single compromised line wouldn't trigger collapse. It would trigger adaptation. I needed to see how. I rerouted my console through a secondary diagnostic layer. One the Empire used for logistics auditing, not designed for intelligence, not optimized for pattern detection, which made it perfect. The data looked messy at first. Noise, unrelated fluctuations. But once I filtered for timing instead of location, the pattern emerged. The compromise line hadn't caused a drop in activity. It had caused a shift. Traffic rerouted. Signals redistributed. Resource flow redirected across alternate paths that weren't active minutes before. I leaned back slowly. They expected this. I whispered. Not just expected it. Planned for it. The network wasn't fragile. It was fluid. No central point. No critical artery. Just movement. Constant, adaptive, self-correcting movement. The Empire didn't build systems like that. Too inefficient. Too unpredictable. Too hard to control. Humanity had built it anyway, because control wasn't the objective. Continuity was. My console flickered again. Not a message this time. A broadcast. Unregistered frequency. Barely detectable. I locked onto it. It wasn't meant for me. It was meant for everything connected to the network. A synchronization pulse. No words. No data. Just a timing signal. And across the scattered anomalies, I watched nodes respond. Small changes. Subtle adjustments. Then, expansion. New lines forming where there had been none. Connections appearing between nodes that had never directly linked before. The network wasn't repairing itself. It was growing around the damage. My pulse slowed. Not from calm. From realization. This wasn't a survival system. It was something else entirely. Something the Empire had never modeled. I stood abruptly. I needed confirmation. I needed context. I needed level 9. This time, I didn't hesitate. I disconnected. Moved fast. The corridor felt different now. Not just hidden. Intentional. Like a space designed to exist outside the assumptions of control. She was already there when I arrived. Waiting. You saw it, she said. Not a question. Yes. Her expression didn't change. They adapted faster than projected. They didn't adapt, I said. They expanded. A pause. Then, yes. I stepped closer to the table. The map was already active, but it had changed. Before it looked like scattered lines. Now, it looked like a web. Not centered. Not hierarchical. Distributed. Alive. You said you've seen this pattern before. I said, we have... And her gaze shifted slightly. Most systems don't survive it. That's not what I asked. No, she agreed. It isn't. Silence. Then, the ones that do, she continued, stop being systems. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. It will. I looked back at the map, at the growing connections, at the way the network didn't behave like infrastructure. It behaved like an ecosystem. My thoughts clicked into place. They're not rebuilding civilization, I said slowly. No, they're redefining it. Yes. The words settled heavily. The Empire's power came from structure, fixed lanes, fixed authority, fixed definitions of what counted as space, trade, existence. Humanity wasn't trying to reclaim its place in that structure. It was building something that didn't need it. Something that couldn't be isolated because it didn't depend on any single point. They can't shut this down, I said. No, they can't even see most of it. Not without changing how they see. I exhaled, then asked a question that had been forming since Phase 2. Why did you intervene? This time, she didn't deflect, because they made the same mistake again, which is, they assumed removal equals control. I nodded slowly. And it doesn't. It never has. Silence. Then, what happens when the network finishes? I asked. Her eyes met mine. Direct. Steady. They won't need permission anymore. That wasn't the full answer. I could feel it. What aren't you telling me? I pressed. A pause. Longer this time. Measured. Then, the Empire will try to correct the error. My chest tightened. How? By redefining the system. That sounded harmless. It wasn't. What does that mean? I asked, It means they will attempt to expand their map to include the gaps. Cold realization hit. If they succeed, they won't isolate you again, she said. They'll absorb you. That was worse. Much worse. Because absorption meant control, compliance, loss of what humanity was becoming. They're going to move soon, I said. Yes. How long? Shorter than your network requires. I turned back to the map, to the expanding web, to the fragile, unfinished structure that was racing against an empire's realization. We need to accelerate, I said. She didn't respond. You knew this, I added. Yes. Then why didn't you warn us? Another pause. Then, because this only works if it's yours. I clenched my jaw. That wasn't comforting. It was responsibility. Heavy and absolute. My console pulsed again. Stronger this time. I reconnected just enough to read it. Multiple signals. Simultaneous. From different nodes. Different locations. Same message. Third line active. I looked up sharply. They're accelerating, I said. Yes, but it's not enough. No. Silence. Then, they need leverage, I said, understanding forming in real time. They can't stay hidden forever. No. They need to force the Empire to recognize what's already happening. Her gaze sharpened slightly. That would be dangerous. Yes, but necessary. A pause. Then, you're changing your role, she said. Not a question. A statement. I met her eyes. Yes. Observer wasn't enough anymore. Analysis wasn't enough. If humanity was building something new, it needed someone inside the old system to break it at the right point. They think this is still theoretical. I said, they think it's noise. Yes. Then we show them it's not. Silence filled the room. Heavy, decisive. Then she nodded. Once. Then you will need to move before they do. I turned toward the exit. Mind already racing. Plans forming. Paths aligning. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about positioning. Control of the narrative. Control of the recognition. If the Empire defined what humanity had become, then humanity would lose. But if humanity forced that definition first, everything changed. I stepped into the corridor, back into the system, back into the structure that thought it still understood the rules. Behind me, her voice followed. Quiet, precise. Be careful. I didn't stop. They won't expect you to attack the system itself, she said. I paused just long enough to respond. I'm not attacking it. A beat. I'm proving it's already broken. Then I kept walking, because the midpoint had just shifted, and for the first time since Earth disappeared from the map, humanity wasn't reacting. It was about to make its move. The Empire didn't panic. It recalibrated. That made it more dangerous. By the time I reconnected fully, the tone of the alerts had changed. The language was still controlled, still procedural, but the frequency had doubled, and the scope had widened beyond isolated anomalies. They were no longer looking at fragments. They were starting to look for patterns. Expanded skin authorization approved. Peripheral sectors flagged for structural deviation analysis. Independent trade flows under temporary review. That last one mattered. Trade was the Empire's bloodstream. If they started tracing it properly, they would find a network. Not all of it, but enough. I moved fast, pulled internal access I technically shouldn't have had anymore. Cross-reference investigation paths. Build a projection model of where their attention would go next. The result was clear. 3 convergence points. 3 places where multiple anomalies overlapped just enough to form a detectable structure. If the Empire focused there, they wouldn't see the whole network, but they'd see enough to understand what it was. And once they understood, they wouldn't try to erase it again. They'd take it. I opened a direct line. Not to a single colony this time. To the network. It took longer to establish. Routing through unstable paths. Avoiding recognized channels. Finally, connection. Multiple signals layered into one. Decentralized. You're visible. I said immediately. A pause. Then, we know. That answer again. Calm. Controlled. How bad? I asked, Localized. Not for long. Another pause. We're accelerating. That's not enough anymore. I said, silence. Then, explain. They're shifting strategy. I said, they're not trying to isolate you anymore. They're trying to understand you. A ripple across the channel. Not fear, recognition. If they map your structure, they'll replicate it. One voice said, or regulate it. Another added, or absorb it. A third finished. Yes, I said. That was the threat, not destruction. Assimilation. They're identifying convergence points. I continued. You need to move them. We can't. That answer was immediate, firm. Why? Because those points aren't constructed. I frowned. What does that mean? A brief exchange across the channel. Then, they're where the system naturally intersects. My thoughts clicked. The network wasn't randomly placed. It followed underlying structures, gravitational folds, trade drift, resource gradients, things the Empire ignored, but that still shaped movement. You build along inevitabilities. I said, yes, which meant you can't move them without breaking the system. Yes. Silence. That was bad, very bad, because it meant the Empire's investigation was already aligned with the network's strongest points. They weren't just looking in the right direction. They were looking at the right places. We need a disruption, I said. Define. Something that forces them to look somewhere else. A pause. Then, that creates exposure. Yes. That risks detection. Yes. Silence stretched. Then, proceed. Decision made. No hesitation. That told me everything I needed to know. They understood the stakes. And they were willing to risk visibility to protect the structure. Stand by, I said. I cut the connection. Turned immediately to the internal system. If the Empire wanted patterns, I would give them one, just not the right one. I accessed the logistics audit layer again. Started injecting anomalies, small at first, minor inconsistencies in trade data, harmless discrepancies in supply routing, then larger, signal echoes in sectors that had no connection to the network, false positives, dozens of them, then hundreds. The system reacted instantly. Alerts spiked. Investigations multiplied. Departments began stepping on each other's processes, chasing overlapping anomalies that didn't connect cleanly. Good. Confusion. That bought time. But not enough, because someone wasn't confused. The inspector. My console lit up. Direct summon. Immediate. No delay. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, then accepted. The chamber was different this time. Not formal. Not procedural. Focused. He didn't sit. Didn't pretend this was routine. You are interfering with system analysis, he said. No preamble. No politeness. Am I? I replied. His upper limbs shifted. Sharp. Controlled. You are generating false data. Define false. A beat. Then, data that does not reflect reality. I held his gaze. Or data that reflects a reality you don't understand yet? That landed. Not enough to stop him, but enough to shift something. You are attempting to obscure a pattern, he said. Yes. No point denying it now. That surprised him. Just slightly. Why? He asked. Because if I lied, he'd know. And if I told the truth, he still wouldn't fully understand. Because you're asking the wrong question, I said. Silence. Then, and what is the right question? I leaned forward. What happens to a system when it's no longer the only one? That hit harder. I saw it. A flicker. Recognition trying to form. You're assuming a parallel structure exists, he said. It does. You have no proof. I don't need proof, I said. I have outcomes. Another pause. Longer this time. He was calculating. Reframing. Where is it? He asked. I smiled just slightly. If you have to ask that, I let the sentence hang. Then, you're already too late. The room went very still. For a moment, I thought he might move to detain me. Instead, he stepped back, just one step. But it mattered because it meant something had shifted. Not understanding, but doubt. And doubt was dangerous. For him, for the system. You're accelerating something you don't control, he said. Yes. And you believe that ends well? I considered that. Honestly. Then, no. That wasn't the answer he expected. But it doesn't end the way you think either. I added. Silence. Then, you're dismissed. Again. But this time, it wasn't control. It was containment. I turned. Walked out. Faster now. Because the situation had changed. The Empire was no longer just observing. It was adapting, which meant the window was closing. Fast. My console pulsed again. Network signal. Urgent. I opened it. Multiple nodes. Simultaneous transmission. Fourth line unstable. My chest tightened. That was closer to the core. Too close. The disruption had worked, but it had also triggered pressure elsewhere. This was the peak. The moment where systems either held or broke. I looked out through the station's observation corridor at the vast structure of the Empire's gate network. Massive, precise, dominant, and for the first time, I didn't see control. I saw rigidity. A system that couldn't adapt fast enough. A system that didn't know it was already being bypassed. I took a slow breath, then turned back toward the core systems, toward the chamber, toward the place where the Empire defined reality, because the next move wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about forcing them to see. And once they did, there would be no going back. The Empire didn't realize it yet, but it had already lost control of the narrative. It just hadn't been told. That was the difference between power and awareness, and I was about to close that gap. I didn't go through the main access routes, didn't request clearance, didn't wait for authorization, because if I did, I would be stopped. Instead, I used the oldest weakness in any system that believed itself complete: maintenance. The access corridor was narrow, functional, ignored, no guards, no oversight, because no one questions infrastructure that is assumed to be irrelevant. That assumption had already cost them everything. The chamber was in session when I entered. Routine proceedings, resource allocation, trade arbitration, all of it built on the idea that the system was still stable, still central, still in control. I walked in anyway. No announcement, no hesitation, and for the first 30 seconds, no one reacted, because confidence, when it's absolute enough, looks like authority. Then recognition spread. Slow, uneven. The inspector saw me first. Of course he did, for eyes locking instantly. Processing, calculating. Too late. I reached the central platform and placed the data core on the table. Not a projection, not a transmission. A physical device, disconnected from the lattice, untraceable, uneditable, real. The chamber shifted, attention focused, not because of me, because of what I brought. You do not have standing here, the inspector said. His voice carried, controlled, but tighter than before. I didn't look at him. Not yet. I'm not here to stand, I said. I'm here to show you something you've already missed. That broke the rhythm. Not a speech, not a defense, a statement. I activated the core. The display unfolded across the chamber, not in their system. Over it, layered, independent. At first, it looked like noise, unregistered signals, trade inconsistencies, anomalies they had already been tracking. But then, it aligned, patterns forming, connections appearing, movement revealing structure. The network, not all of it, not enough to expose it fully, but enough to make one thing undeniable. It existed, and it was operational. A ripple moved through the chamber. Delegates shifting, systems attempting to categorize what they were seeing, and failing. Impossible, someone said. No, I replied calmly. Inevitable. Now I looked at the inspector. This is what happens when you remove a system from your map. I said, it doesn't disappear. I gestured to the expanding web. It moves somewhere you're not looking. Silence. Heavy. Then, you fabricated this, he said. Not belief. Reflex. Check your own data. I replied, you already have pieces of this. That was the truth, and he knew it. I could see it in the micro movements. the hesitation, the recalibration. You're seeing fragments, I continued, because you're only capable of seeing within your own structure. I stepped back slightly, let the display expand further, new connections lighting up in real time, because the network wasn't static. It was live. You think this is a hidden system, I said. It's not. It's a different one. That landed. Hard. Because it wasn't a threat. It was a reality. You can't isolate it, I continued. You can't shut it down. And you can't absorb it without breaking the rules your entire empire depends on. A voice from the chamber. Different species, sharp tone. Then we changed the rules. I smiled. There it was. The move I'd been waiting for. You can try, I said, but you're already too late. I tapped the core. The display shifted again. This time, trade flows. Real ones, registered ones, imperial ones, intersecting with the network. Not directly, not obviously, but undeniably. You're already using it, I said quietly. That broke them, not emotionally, structurally, because if the empire was already dependent, then control was gone. You've built your economy on routes you don't fully track, I continued. You've allowed independent systems to operate in the gaps. And now those gaps are connected. I let the silence stretch, then delivered the final piece. You didn't exile humanity, I said. You forced it into the only space you never learned how to control. The chamber held still, processing, reframing, failing to resolve. The inspector stepped forward, slow, measured. You're presenting a claim, he said. Yes. Without formal recognition. Yes. Without jurisdiction. Yes. And you expect his body to accept it? I met his gaze. No. That stopped him. For a fraction of a second. Then, what do you expect? He asked. I leaned forward slightly, lowered my voice just enough to force attention. I expect you to realize that acceptance isn't required. I gestured to the network. To this. To what's already happening. This exists whether you recognize it or not. And every moment you spend trying to deny it, I let the sentence hang. Then, is a moment it grows without you. Silence. Total. Absolute. Then, movement. Not from the inspector. From the chamber itself. Delegates communicating. Cross-referencing. Running internal checks. Because now, they weren't asking if it was real. They were asking how much of it already was. I stepped back, gave them space. Because the breaking point wasn't my words. It was their realization. And it was happening. I could see it, feel it. The shift from control to uncertainty, from certainty to doubt. And doubt was where systems failed. My console pulsed. Network signal. I didn't look at it immediately. Didn't need to. I already knew what it would say. Because I could see it on the display. The web expanding. Stabilizing. Holding. Then I checked anyway. One line. Simple. Final. Fifth line secured. I exhaled slowly. It was done. Not finished. But irreversible. I looked back at the chamber. At the empire. At the system that had tried to erase humanity from existence. And failed in the only way that mattered. They couldn't pretend this wasn't happening anymore. They couldn't ignore it. And they couldn't control it. The inspector's voice cut through the silence. Quieter now. More measured. What are you proposing? He asked. There it was. Not rejection. Not denial. Engagement. I held his gaze. And for the first time since Earth disappeared from the map, I wasn't responding. I was defining. You don't get to decide what we are anymore. I said. A pause. Then, but you can decide what happens next. And that was the line. No one spoke for a long time. That, more than anything, confirmed it. Not denial. Not outrage. Silence. Because silence meant recalculation. The chamber was no longer deciding whether humanity's claim was valid. It was deciding what to do about a reality it could no longer control. The inspector didn't move immediately. He stood where he was, all four eyes fixed on a layered display. The Empire's lattice, and over it, the network that should not exist, but did. You've created an unregulated system, he said finally. not accusation. Recognition. Yes, I replied. That system intersects with ours. Yes. And you expect coexistence? I considered that. Then, I expect inevitability. That wasn't confidence. It was fact, because coexistence wasn't a choice anymore. It was already happening. The chamber stirred. Delegates exchanging rapid data bursts. Legal frameworks being pulled. Ancient clauses re-examined in real time. They were searching for a way to categorize this. To name it, because naming something meant defining it. And defining it meant controlling it. But this didn't fit. You exist outside jurisdiction, another voice said. Yes, but you interact with jurisdictions. Yes, then you cannot remain undefined. There it was, the trap. If they defined humanity, they would contain it. If they didn't, they would lose authority over everything it touched. I stepped forward, not aggressively, not defensively, precisely. You're trying to solve the wrong problem, I said. That cut through the chamber faster than anything else, because it wasn't resistance. It was correction. You think this is about classification. I continued. It's not. It's about dependency. I expanded the display again. Focus now. Refined. Imperial routes. Core trade arteries. Supply chains. Then overlay. Subtle intersections. Hidden dependencies. Small at first. Then larger. Then undeniable. You've already integrated with us. I said quietly. Not officially. Not intentionally. But functionally. Silence tightened again, because now the stakes were clear. They couldn't isolate humanity without disrupting themselves. They couldn't absorb humanity without breaking their own rules. And they couldn't ignore humanity without losing relevance. You built something we cannot govern, the inspector said. It wasn't a question. No, I replied, but we didn't build it to replace you. That mattered, because this wasn't conquest. This wasn't dominance. It was independence. What do you want? A delegate asked. Not hostile, not cooperative, just necessary. I let the question settle, because the answer had to be exact. We don't want re-entry, I said. That alone shifted the room. Expectation broken. We don't want your structure. Another shift, more subtle, more dangerous. We want recognition. A pause. Then I clarified. Not as a member, not as a subject, but as something that exists alongside you. The words landed carefully, because this wasn't a demand for power. It was a demand for position. You're asking for a parallel designation, the inspector said. Yes, that has never existed. I nodded. It does now. Silence again, but different this time. Not confusion, not resistance. Evaluation, because they could see it. Not just the network, but the consequences. If they refused, humanity would continue anyway. If they attacked, they would fracture their own systems. If they accepted, they would change the structure of power itself. None of those outcomes favored control, which meant only one thing mattered. Stability. The inspector turned slightly, not away from me, toward the chamber, communicating, processing. Then he faced me again. What guarantees do we have? He asked. There are no guarantees, I said. Honest, uncomfortable, real. There's only reality. I gestured to the network, to this, to what already exists. You can either acknowledge it, a beat, or spend the next century trying to catch up to it. That wasn't a threat. It was a timeline the chamber held. Then, a shift, subtle, but irreversible. A delegate, one of the older species, long quiet, sent a formal signal, proposal marker, not rejection, not approval, initiation. Others followed, not many, not yet, but enough, because in systems like this, momentum didn't start with consensus. It started with fracture, and once fracture began, change followed. The inspector exhaled slowly, a controlled release. The exile remains on record, he said. Yes, it is not revoked. I know, but it is no longer enforceable in its original form. There it was, not victory, not reversal. Something more precise. A shift in reality. You will be classified under provisional designation, he continued. External autonomous network entity. I almost smiled. Clumsy, imperfect, accurate. You will operate outside standard jurisdiction. Yes, but any interaction with Imperial systems will require negotiation. Of course. A pause. Then, you are not within our structure. No, but you are no longer excluded from it. That was the line. Drawn, not by permission, but by necessity. The chamber began moving again, not as before. Different, slower, more careful, because now they weren't the only system in existence anymore. I deactivated the core. The network faded from view. Not gone, just no longer displayed. I turned to leave. No one stopped me. No one could. At the threshold, I paused, just for a moment, then looked back, not at the inspector, not at the delegates, at the space where the network had been. Still there, still growing, still beyond their control. And for the first time since Earth disappeared from the map, I felt something close to quiet. Not victory, not relief, something steadier. We hadn't reclaimed our place. We hadn't forced our way back in. We had done something else, something harder. We had built a place they couldn't take away. Outside the chamber, the station felt different, not physically, but fundamentally. The illusion of total control was gone, replaced by something more honest, more unstable, more real. My console pulsed. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened it. Direct link. Earth. The signal was clear, strong, unhidden. A single message. No compression. No encryption. No fear. Line holds. I exhaled, looked out through the station viewport, at the vast structure of the Imperial network. Still massive, still powerful, still there, but no longer alone. Beyond it, invisible to their maps, untouched by their control, humanity had drawn something new across the stars. Not a border, not a territory, a line, and it was holding.